On the airplane, the air hostess removed her stockings, not only without embarrassment but also with a serious expression, instructing all female passengers to do the same. The reason was that the plane was about to make an emergency landing. This is a true story and the first civil aviation emergency landing incident in Chinese history. On September 10, 1998, a China Eastern Airlines flight was en route from Shanghai to Beijing, carrying a total of 137 passengers and crew members. After a smooth takeoff following taxiing, the aircraft's landing gear was retracted, but the captain noticed that the front landing gear indicator light did not go out. This indicated that the front landing gear had not retracted properly. The captain attempted to retract the landing gear again, but the light remained red. This indicated that the front landing gear was stuck and could neither retract nor extend properly. Without the front landing gear, a normal landing was impossible, and only an emergency landing was feasible. The captain was aware of the severity of the situation and immediately notified the control tower to request clearance for an emergency landing. The control tower agreed and directed other aircraft to clear the runway. However, without the front landing gear, the nose of the aircraft would make direct contact with the ground during the emergency landing, posing an extremely high risk of a catastrophic crash. Upon hearing the flight attendant's announcement about returning to the airport, the passengers cooperated without much thought. Soon, the aircraft arrived at the airport, where ground personnel observed that the front landing gear had indeed not been deployed. The captain chose not to execute an emergency landing but instead circled in the air. There were two main reasons for this: first, to burn off fuel and reduce the aircraft's weight, and second, to buy time to find a solution, as an emergency landing was the last resort. On the ground, various departments were urgently seeking solutions to the landing gear malfunction. Engineer Lu Yuan was appointed as the overall commander. He contacted the captain to check if there were any hydraulic system failures. No problems were found. With only 2 hours of fuel left for circling, if the issue wasn't resolved within that time frame, a risky emergency landing would be inevitable. Lu Yuan proposed using landing gear slinging technique. In this maneuver, the aircraft would dive downward, and when it was just tens of meters above the ground, it would suddenly climb sharply, using its massive inertia to dislodge the stuck landing gear. The captain accurately executed a series of maneuvers. Unfortunately, the landing gear wasn't dislodged. Several attempts were made to perform sharp turns, but they didn't work. These strange flight maneuvers caused panic among the passengers, who speculated that something was wrong with the aircraft. The cabin suddenly erupted into chaos, and the flight attendants, although flustered, maintained their professionalism by keeping smiles on their faces and began to reassure the passengers. Similarly, fire trucks and ambulances rushed to the airport. At this point, Chief Commander Lu Yuan instructed the captain to attempt a tailstrike landing using the rear landing gear, to observe if the front landing gear would lower due to the vibration. The captain instructed the chief flight attendant to lead all passengers to the rear of the aircraft to shift the center of gravity backward. The flight attendants orderly guided the passengers to move backward and then instructed them on anti-collision procedures. Although the passengers followed along, they were internally terrified and already paralyzed with fear. The chief flight attendant used the intercom to calm the passengers' emotions. Soon, the rear landing gear made contact with the ground. The intense vibrations caused luggage to scatter throughout the cabin. Fortunately, the tremors were brief because the aircraft, under the captain's control, had already taken off again. However, the front landing gear indicator light remained red. With fuel running low and a looming emergency landing, there was one last method to attempt: manually opening the front landing gear switch by human power to lower the front landing gear. This method was very dangerous, but for the sake of the more than 100 lives on board, an observer stepped forward and volunteered to go to the landing gear compartment. He secured himself with a simple safety rope, grabbed an axe, and descended. He opened the compartment door, braced against the airflow, and reached the front landing gear. After locating the manual switch, he vigorously struck it with the axe, but the landing gear remained immovable. At this moment, the observer discovered that the cause of the malfunction was due to the fracture of the pin in the front landing gear. This meant that no method could lower the front landing gear. Now, there was only one final option: an emergency landing. The captain lit a cigarette to stabilize emotions and awaited ground instructions. Meanwhile, at the command center, there was intense debate on how to proceed with the emergency landing. The first plan involved landing on the runway, but without the front landing gear, the aircraft's nose would directly contact the ground, leading to potential friction-induced fires or fatal impacts. The second plan involved landing on grassy terrain, where the softer ground would mitigate the risk of fire due to friction. However, because it was soil, there was a risk that the heavy aircraft would sink in, potentially causing an explosion. The command center decided to proceed with the first plan, landing on the runway. The chief commander communicated with the captain, reassuring him that everything would be fine. However, the chief commander was so nervous that he broke his pencil because he lacked confidence. He knew that the most dangerous aspect of this emergency landing was the risk of the aircraft's front part rubbing against the ground and catching fire. He instructed firefighters to spray fire retardant foam urgently on the runway to significantly reduce the risk of ignition. However, with insufficient fuel on the aircraft, there wasn't enough time to cover the entire runway with foam. They sprayed foam at both ends of the runway. Before the emergency landing, the captain was extremely nervous, but he had to pull himself together because he held the lives of all passengers and crew on board in his hands. The flight attendant informed the passengers through the broadcast system that the aircraft was about to make an emergency landing and asked them to cooperate with the crew. Then, the flight attendants instructed passengers to remove their jewelry to prevent secondary injuries and to take off their stockings to avoid them adhering to the skin and burning in case of fire. All ground personnel evacuated as the aircraft prepared for landing. The flight attendants collectively shouted out instructions for bracing for impact, while passengers in the cabin closed their eyes and followed the instructions for bracing. Meanwhile, the captain tightly gripped the controls, overcoming his fear, and controlled the aircraft to make the smoothest possible emergency landing. The airplane's rear landing gear landed smoothly. Due to the lack of front landing gear, the front part of the airplane began to slowly descend. Since there was no fire foam in the middle of the runway, it caught fire as soon as it touched the ground. Everyone's heart was in their throat. At the end of the runway, there was still a section of fire foam. If this stretch couldn't bring the airplane to a halt, the consequences would be unimaginable. Fortunately, when the cabin made contact with the fire foam, the sparks extinguished and the airplane stopped. At that moment, the fire trucks and ambulances were all in position. The flight attendant glanced out the window, shouted over the intercom for evacuation, then opened the emergency doors, deploying the evacuation slides. Passengers disregarded everything and rushed towards the emergency exits, while the flight attendants did not flee. They were fulfilling their final duty, assisting passengers in evacuating. Ultimately, this incident, the first ever capital civil aviation aircraft forced landing in China's history, resulted in no casualties. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like. It really helps the channel. Thank you for watching.